Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Getting lost in the woods during a camping trip is never a good idea. But when you're young, your survival instinct hasn't fully developed yet. I remember when I was 15, back in the summer of 1997. My family had rented a cabin at Pine Ridge National Forest for 2 weeks. My cousin Jake had come along too. He was the same age as me and we'd been inseparable since kindergarten. Every night after the adults fell asleep, Jake and I would sneak out of the cabin. We'd take our flashlights, but rarely used them, preferring instead to let our eyes adjust to the darkness. There was something thrilling about navigating by moonlight, feeling like explorers discovering uncharted territory. On our 5th night there, we decided to venture deeper into the forest than we'd gone before. The moon was just a sliver that night, and the stars seemed impossibly bright above the pine trees. Everything was going fine, until we heard something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A soft, rhythmic whispering coming from somewhere behind us. We spun around, fumbling to switch on our flashlights. The beams cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing but trees and underbrush. Jake and I exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. We continued walking, but more cautiously now. Not even 2 minutes later, we heard it again. This time lower, more guttural, and unmistakably human. We whirled around with our lights, but again saw nothing. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Jake nodded, and we turned around, walking faster now. That's when we heard something moving through the undergrowth, not walking, but crawling. There was a scraping sound, like someone dragging themselves across the forest floor. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Jake grabbed my arm, and we both froze as our flashlight beams finally caught something. A figure in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, covered in dirt and pine needles, crawling between the trees about 20 feet away. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly raised its head toward us, and I saw it was an elderly woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her white hair wild and tangled with twigs and leaves. For what felt like eternity, nobody moved. Then the woman gradually pulled herself up to standing, brushed some dirt from her dress, and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly clear. "Well, hello there, young folks," she said with a slight southern accent. "I must have taken quite a tumble. Been picking night mushrooms. They only bloom under the new moon, you know, and I guess these old legs aren't what they used to be." The relief that washed over me was so intense I nearly collapsed. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a local herbalist who lived in a cottage on the edge of the forest. She'd lost her flashlight when she fell, and had been trying to find her way by feeling the ground. We helped Mrs. Blackwood back to the main trail, and she insisted on giving us each a small pouch of what she called protection herbs, as thanks. The scent was pleasant, like lavender, and something else I couldn't identify. "Keep these close," she told us with a wink. "The forest has many secrets, and not all who wander here have good intentions. When we got back to our cabin, we never told our parents about what happened. But for the rest of our stay, we kept those herb pouches with us whenever we went outside, and we never ventured out after dark again. 27 years have passed since that night, but sometimes when I'm camping and hear rustling in the darkness, I remember the sound of something crawling through the underbrush, and I wonder what might have happened if what we'd encountered hadn't been Mrs. Blackwood after all. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Mike, and what I'm about to tell you made me quit my job as a ranger in the national park and move to the city. It happened last summer in the northern Appalachians, in a part of the forest that locals call Silent Valley. I had worked there for 5 years and thought I knew every corner, every trail, every tree. But what happened that night proved to me that I knew nothing about this forest. And perhaps no one really does. It was early July. The tourist season was in full swing, and I was assigned to check the remote campsites in the eastern section of the park. The day was hot and humid, typical for the region, and I decided to spend the night in a small cabin located 20 miles from the main road. I planned to continue my rounds in the morning. The cabin was simple, one room with a bed, a stove, a table, and a few shelves with canned food. The windows overlooked a small clearing surrounded by old oaks and maples, which were at least 200 years old. I left my radio on the table. Reception in this part of the park was unreliable. Lit a small fire outside and prepared dinner. As the sun began to set, the forest filled with familiar sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional hooting of an owl, leaves rustling in the wind, the usual symphony of wildlife that I had listened to hundreds of times. But around 10:30, something changed. I was lying in bed, reading an old magazine by the light of a lantern, when I suddenly realized that everything had gone quiet. Complete silence. No crickets, no night birds. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving the leaves. In the forest, this was rare, and it usually meant a large predator was nearby, a bear or a mountain lion. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. The moon was almost full, and the clearing was bathed in its silvery light. Nothing unusual. I was about to return to my reading when I heard it, a quiet voice, barely audible, somewhere outside. "Help! I'm lost." The voice belonged to a child, a little girl, judging by the intonation. I immediately grabbed my jacket and flashlight. A child in the forest, in the middle of the night, that's an emergency. "Where are you?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. "Don't be afraid, I'm a ranger." My voice dissolved into the silence, and for a moment I thought I had just imagined it. But then she answered, "I'm here." By the trees. The voice was coming from the edge of the clearing, where the thick undergrowth began. I pointed my flashlight there, but saw nothing. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'm coming to you." I began slowly moving across the clearing, holding the flashlight in front of me. As I approached the trees, I noticed a small figure standing between two old oaks. It was a girl, seemingly 8 or 9 years old, wearing a simple white dress. She stood motionless, her head lowered. "Hello," I said softly, trying not to scare her. "What's your name? Are you lost?" The girl slowly raised her head, but her face remained in shadow. "I need help," she said. "Can I come into your cabin?" Something in her voice made me freeze. It sounded wrong, like a child's voice, but with some strange vibration, as if someone was imitating a child. "Of course," I replied, but didn't move. "But first, tell me, how did you get here? Where are your parents?" The girl took a step forward, and the moonlight fell on her face. And then I saw her eyes. She had no eyes, just black voids, as if someone had cut 2 round holes in her face and filled them with ink. Not just dark eyes, but completely black. No whites, no pupils, nothing human. I stepped back, nearly falling. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. "Please," she said, taking another step forward. "I just need to come in. Invite me inside." Her voice changed. Now it sounded as if several people were speaking simultaneously. A child's voice, an adult's, and another one. Old, very old. I turned and ran to the cabin. I locked the door, grabbed the radio, and tried to call the base, but heard only static noise. Then I looked out the window. There were now 3 children standing in the clearing, the same girl and 2 boys, all with those horrible black eyes. They were looking directly at me, not moving, not blinking. "Let us in," they said simultaneously, and their voices were as clear as if they were standing right next to me. "We're cold. We're lonely. Let us in and we'll show you something special." I recoiled from the window and pressed myself against the opposite wall. Time dragged on endlessly. Every minute I checked the radio, but there was no signal. I didn't dare look out the window again, but I heard their voices calling to me, first gently, then insistently, and then with anger. Sometime after 3 in the morning, the voices stopped. When the first rays of the sun broke through the window, I finally dared to look outside. The clearing was empty, but around the cabin, in a perfect circle, lay small piles of stones, neatly stacked on top of each other. And hanging from the trees were bizarre structures made of branches, forming what looked like human figures. I gathered my things and left without looking back. When I reached the main road, my radio started working again, and I reported that I was sick and returning to headquarters. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? A week later, I quit. Before leaving, I asked locals about strange children in the forest. Most just shrugged, but an old Native American from the reservation north of the park just looked at me with his wise eyes and said, "They were here long before us, and they'll be here when we're all gone." Later, I learned that in the 19th century, when these lands were just being settled, an entire community disappeared without a trace, 37 people, including 11 children. They were never found. I live in Boston now, among concrete and glass, where there is no place for mysteries. But sometimes at night, when I lie in bed listening to the sounds of the city, I think I hear their voices calling to me from the darkness. And I know for certain that I will never go into the forest alone again. I never used to be afraid of the wilderness. Growing up in rural Montana, I spent half my childhood exploring forests and camping under the stars. But after what happened last autumn in the Adirondacks, I haven't been able to bring myself to sleep in a tent again. It was mid-October, that perfect time when the leaves had turned but hadn't yet fallen, and the air had just enough chill to make a campfire feel like heaven. 6 of us had hiked 5 miles into a remote section of the park, far from the marked trails and designated camping areas. My buddy Marcus knew the area well. He'd been coming here since he was a kid, and had promised us an experience free from other hikers and the usual weekend warriors. The first 2 nights were everything he'd promised. We fished in the pristine lake, cooked our catch over open flames, and stayed up telling ghost stories like we were teenagers again. On the 3rd night, we'd all turned in early, exhausted from a day-long hike up to Eagle's Peak. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. No moonlight filtered through the nylon of my tent, so it must have been cloudy. What pulled me from sleep wasn't a sound, not at first, but a strange sensation. Like being watched. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was nothing, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate sniffing sound, moving slowly around the perimeter of my tent. My first thought was bear, but this wasn't the heavy breathing of a large animal. This was methodical, intentional. The sniffing paused at one spot, right where my head would be visible as a shadow from outside, then continued around toward the tent entrance. I reached over in the darkness, my hand finding Jake's shoulder. He was already awake, completely rigid. On my other side, Chris's eyes reflected the faint glow of his watch, 3:15 in the morning. The sniffing moved away from our tent, heading toward where Sarah, Marcus, and Lily were sleeping. We exchanged glances, not daring to speak. Then from their direction came a sound I'll never forget, a scream that started human, but twisted into something primal, something that spoke to ancient fears coded into our DNA. We burst from our tent, fumbling with the zipper in our panic. In the dim light of the dying campfire, I saw Marcus standing outside their tent, his grandfather's revolver pointed shakily at the tree line. Sarah was behind him, clutching Lily, who was sobbing uncontrollably. "What happened?" I gasped, scanning the darkness. "There was someone," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "Not an animal. A person." They were pressing their face against our tent, sniffing. Like they were hunting, we huddled together, the 6 of us forming a tight circle as Marcus kept the gun pointed outward. That's when I noticed our campsite. Our food cache, which we'd carefully hung from a tree branch to keep away from bears, had been cut down. The waterproof bags had been methodically sliced open, but strangely, not everything was taken. Only certain items, the jerky, the dried fruits, anything with a strong scent. Maybe it was just a hungry hiker, Chris suggested, though none of us believed it. We spent the remaining hours until dawn packed together in the largest tent, taking turns keeping watch. As the first light broke through the trees, we quickly gathered our essentials, leaving the heavier gear behind in our rush to get back to civilization. It was only as we were nearly running down the trail that Lily told us the worst part. Before the screaming started, before Marcus had woken up and grabbed his gun, she'd opened her eyes to find a face pressed against the tent fabric, not distinct, just a dark silhouette. And as she watched, frozen in terror, the figure had inhaled deeply and whispered a single word: "Perfect." The rangers we reported it to found our campsite undisturbed except for the food. They suggested it might have been a black bear, despite our insistence otherwise. The case was filed away. Another strange encounter in a vast wilderness. But I know what we experienced. Sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I still hear that methodical sniffing, like someone searching, selecting, deciding. And I keep my windows closed now, even on the warmest nights. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but some experiences just stick with you, no matter how many years pass. This happened during my expedition to the remote corners of Alaska's Denali Wilderness back in the 90s. My buddy Max and I were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. At least that's what we told ourselves. We'd been planning this particular trip for months. A 2-week trek through some of the most untouched territory in North America. By the 5th night, we had ventured deeper into the wilderness than most tourists ever dare. That evening, the northern lights danced across the sky like nothing I'd ever seen before. We stayed up late, passing a flask back and forth, mesmerized by the green and purple waves above us. Eventually, the temperature dropped to about 20 below, and we retreated to our separate tents. I must have fallen asleep instantly. The next thing I remember was waking up in complete darkness, feeling something massive and incredibly warm pressing against my back through the tent fabric. At first, in my half-asleep state, I thought maybe Max had sleepwalked into my tent. But no, I was alone inside. Whatever this was, it was outside, and it was enormous. "Max," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "You awake over there?" There was a pause before his muffled voice came back, alarmed. "Yeah, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath, trying not to move a muscle. "Nothing, man. Everything's cool," I lied, not wanting to alarm whatever was pressed against my tent. That's when I felt it shift, a massive weight moving against the nylon wall of my tent. I could hear deep, rhythmic breathing. My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain the creature could hear it. For what felt like an eternity but was probably around 20 minutes, I lay completely still, barely breathing. My hunting knife was less than an arm's length away, but I knew better than to make any sudden movements. In the Alaskan wilderness, there were only a few animals that size, and none of them were creatures you'd want to startle. Finally, I felt the pressure ease as the massive presence stood up. The sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow circled my tent once before slowly fading into the distance. When dawn broke, Max and I cautiously emerged from our tents. There in the fresh snow were the unmistakable tracks of a full-grown grizzly bear, and they led right to where my tent had been slightly compressed. The ranger we spoke to later told us that during particularly cold nights, bears occasionally seek out human camps for warmth, despite not having fully entered hibernation. This one must have been desperate enough to breach its natural fear of humans and lean against my tent for warmth. 99 times out of 100, that encounter ends very differently, the ranger said, shaking his head in disbelief. I still go camping occasionally, but I've never returned to Alaska. Some might call it an amazing experience, but I call it what it really was, the closest brush with death I've ever had. All while I was tucked in my sleeping bag, completely unaware until it was almost too late. It's often said that ghosts and monsters can be frightening, but in my experience, it's usually people who are the real source of fear. At least that's what I thought, until what happened to me and my girlfriend Sarah changed my perspective forever. This was back in 2018, when we decided to go backpacking through the Appalachian Mountains in early October. We were both experienced hikers, but neither of us was prepared for what would happen on our second night on the trail. We had set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. The weather forecast had mentioned a slight chance of rain, but nothing prepared us for the violent thunderstorm that rolled in just after midnight. The wind howled through the trees like a banshee, and rain pounded against our tent with such force I thought it might tear through the fabric. I woke up around 4 in the morning to the sound of something else mixing with the storm voices. At first I thought I was dreaming, but they became clearer, more distinct. Human voices just outside our tent. "Sarah," I whispered, gently shaking her. "I think there's someone outside." "What?" "That's impossible," she mumbled sleepily. "We're miles from any trail." The voices grew louder. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and unzipped the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. 2 figures stood there in the pouring rain, both holding what looked like hunting rifles pointed directly at me. They wore dark rain ponchos, their faces partially obscured by the darkness and the downpour. "Don't move," one of them said, his voice barely audible over the storm. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Sarah, stay inside," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. But Sarah, worried about me, didn't listen. She crawled out behind me, gasping when she saw our visitors. We stood there, drenched by the rain, staring down the barrels of 2 rifles. I was certain this was how it would end for us, murdered in the wilderness, with no witnesses. Then one of the figures lowered his weapon slightly. "We don't mean any harm," he said. "We're park rangers. Got separated from our group during night patrol when this storm hit. We've been walking for hours trying to find shelter." The tension in my body didn't immediately release. "Park rangers? At this hour? In this storm?" The second figure nodded. "Mountain rescue training exercise gone wrong. We saw your tent light and hoped you might have a radio or something. Ours got damaged in the rain." Still cautious, but sensing they might be telling the truth, I offered, "We don't have a radio, but I've got some hot coffee if you want to warm up." They accepted gratefully, lowering their rifles completely. As they moved closer to our campsite, lightning illuminated their uniforms, confirming their story. We had just started boiling water on our portable stove when it happened. A deafening crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Before any of us could react, an enormous oak tree came crashing down directly on top of our tent, crushing it completely. The 4 of us stood in stunned silence, the rain still pelting down around us. "If you hadn't come out to check on us," one of the rangers started, "or if Sarah had stayed inside like I told her to," I added, my voice shaking. The tree had completely flattened our tent. Had we been inside, we would have been killed instantly. As dawn broke and the storm finally passed, the rangers helped us salvage what gear we could. They radioed their base camp once their equipment dried out, and by afternoon, we were safely back at the ranger station, sharing our story with astonished staff. Looking back now, I still get chills thinking about how close we came to death that night. What initially seemed like the worst possible scenario being confronted by armed strangers in the middle of nowhere turned out to be what saved our lives. I'm not saying you should trust every stranger you meet in the wilderness, especially those carrying weapons. But sometimes, what appears to be danger might actually be your salvation. And sometimes, the real dangers are the ones you never see coming, like a tree falling in a storm. I felt a strange uneasiness crawl up my spine as I turned to Jake and whispered, "There's someone hiding between those pines, right along the trail we need to take back to the cabin." We had hiked deeper into the Adirondack Mountains than we intended, and the autumn dusk was settling faster than I'd anticipated. Jake rolled his eyes and clicked on his flashlight. "Man, it's just these woods playing tricks on you. 3 hours of hiking, and that energy bar wasn't enough. Your blood sugar's probably low and you're seeing things." For a moment, I wavered, doubt creeping in. Maybe he was right. The shadows did seem to shift and dance in peculiar ways as the wind rustled through the leaves. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since we began our return journey, and my breath now formed small clouds in the air. "Yeah, maybe," I conceded, adjusting my backpack. "Let's just get back before it's completely dark." We continued along the narrow path, dried leaves crunching beneath our boots. The spot where I thought I'd seen someone came and went without incident. I felt my shoulders relax slightly as we approached the final stretch that would lead us to the main trail. That's when we heard it, a distinct snap of a branch, followed by the scraping of something heavy being dragged across the forest floor. The sound came from about 20 feet behind us. We froze in unison, exchanged glances, and slowly turned around. Standing in the middle of the dirt path, back turned to us, was a figure in a faded red parka with a tattered hood. The jacket hung oddly on their frame, as if the person inside was somehow misshapen. Their jeans were caked with what looked like dried mud, and something darker staining the cuffs. Heavy hiking boots, worn down on one side, completed the unsettling silhouette. In that moment, I felt a primal fear, unlike anything I'd experienced in my 32 years of life. My heart thundered in my chest, so violently I was certain Jake could hear it. Jake stepped slightly in front of me, always the protective one, and called out, his voice remarkably steady, "Hey there. You lost or something? The ranger station is about 2 miles. He never finished." As soon as Jake began speaking, the figure's shoulders started to shake. A sound emerged from them that I initially mistook for crying. But it wasn't crying. It was laughter, a broken, disjointed sound that rose and fell in unnatural patterns, more like a damaged recording than anything human. The laughter echoed through the trees, bouncing back at us from all directions. Temperature seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. Then, with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl, the figure rotated to face us, still laughing. And just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped, cutting off as if someone had flipped a switch. The face beneath the hood, God, I wish I could forget that face. Paper-white skin stretched too tightly over sharp cheekbones. But it was the eyes that haunt my nightmares to this day, entirely black, like pools of oil catching the last light of day, reflecting nothing back. The figure's head tilted at an impossible angle, like a curious bird examining something it might want to eat. Jake's hand found my wrist and squeezed hard enough to bruise. No words were needed. In perfect synchronicity, we turned and ran. We sprinted nearly 4 miles back to our rental cabin, our lungs burning and legs threatening to give out. The entire time, that terrible laughter seemed to follow us, sometimes sounding right behind us, sometimes seemingly ahead on the trail. Once I swear I heard it coming from the trees directly above us. When we finally burst through the cabin door, I collapsed to my knees and was violently sick on the welcome mat. Jake slammed the door shut through the deadbolt and methodically went through the entire cabin, locking every window, closing every blind, checking every closet. We spent the night huddled in the living room, back to back. A hunting knife Jake had found in a kitchen drawer clutched in his trembling hands. Neither of us slept. At first light, we packed our things and drove 3 hours to the nearest town without stopping once. I've never returned to those mountains. Jake and I don't talk about what happened that day, but sometimes I catch him staring out windows at dusk with a haunted look in his eyes. If you enjoy hiking in remote areas, please stay on marked trails. Always tell someone your route, and most importantly, if you hear laughter in the woods where no one should be, run. Don't look back. Just run. I was driving home after a long shift at the hospital one winter evening when a blizzard started approaching. Being originally from Florida, I have this deep-seated aversion to getting soaked or frozen, snow, rain, whatever. I avoid it like the plague. So I was pushing my old Subaru a little faster than was probably wise on those mountain roads. About halfway to my cabin, the snow finally began falling in earnest. Thick, heavy flakes that quickly transformed from picturesque to perilous. The second half of my journey became unbearable. Visibility dropped to almost nothing despite my wipers working overtime. And I had to crawl along at what felt like 5 miles per hour. When I finally reached the small community where I'd been renting for the past 6 months, the snowfall had turned into a full-blown whiteout. My parking spot was positioned, so I could just barely make out my cabin through the swirling snow. But it was on the opposite side of the clearing. If I got out now, I'd be completely drenched and frozen within seconds. I decided to wait in my car until the storm let up a bit. I know that might sound ridiculous. I could have just dashed inside and changed immediately. But something about being cold and wet just brings back terrible childhood memories of being stuck in wet clothes for hours after falling into Lake Okeechobee. It wasn't dangerously cold inside the car, so I turned off the engine to save gas and just sat there listening to a true crime podcast, occasionally brushing snow from my windshield when it piled up too thick. I must have been waiting for about 45 minutes when something caught my eye near my cabin. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me through the snow, but I squinted and looked twice to be sure. The door to my cabin swung open, and 3 figures emerged carrying what appeared to be my belongings. One had my laptop bag slung over their shoulder, while another was struggling with my vintage record player. I was so stunned, I couldn't move for several seconds. My first instinct was to confront them, but then I remembered the last episode of my podcast about homeowners who surprised burglars and didn't live to regret it. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff's department. It felt surreal explaining to the dispatcher that I was sitting in my car, during a blizzard watching strangers rob my home. The sheriff and 2 deputies arrived with surprising speed, given the weather conditions. I pointed out the direction I'd seen the thieves heading, toward the service road that winds behind the property. The officers located and apprehended them less than a mile away, their truck having slid into a ditch in the treacherous conditions. By the time the arrests were made, the snowfall had finally begun to ease. One of the deputies escorted me to my cabin to assess the damage. "You're one lucky son of a gun," he told me as we surveyed the mess inside. "These 3 have been hitting isolated properties throughout the county for months. They don't usually leave witnesses." When the suspects were searched, the officers found not just knives, but a handgun with the serial number filed off. Apparently, they were wanted in connection with a string of burglaries across 3 states, including one that ended with an elderly couple being hospitalized after a brutal attack. My ridiculous hatred of getting wet and cold, a quirk my ex-girlfriend used to tease me mercilessly about, might have saved my life. If I had rushed through the snow to get inside as soon as I arrived, I would have walked in on 3 armed men in the middle of robbing my place. Instead, I spent nearly an hour waiting in my car, unknowingly giving them time to break in, and then catching them on their way out. Sometimes our strange little habits and aversions serve purposes we never could have imagined. I've since moved back to a more populated area, but I still wait in my car whenever it rains or snows. Not just because I hate getting wet, but because once, that peculiar quirk of mine created the perfect timing that kept me safe. My name is Ethan Blackwood, and this happened to me last autumn, during the worst nor'easter Massachusetts had seen in decades. That evening, I found myself trapped by a ferocious storm in my century-old colonial home on the outskirts of Salem. The storm had intensified beyond what any meteorologist had predicted, with winds powerful enough to bend the ancient oak trees surrounding my property until they looked like they might snap at any moment. Rain lashed against the windows with such force I feared the glass might shatter, and the constant rumble of thunder seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I was alone that night. My husband and our daughter had left 2 days earlier to visit his parents in Chicago, and I had stayed behind to finish a deadline for work. Now, as the storm raged, I was grateful they weren't experiencing this terror, yet simultaneously longing for their company. The power had cut out around 7 in the evening, plunging the house into an unsettling darkness, broken only by the occasional burst of lightning that painted the rooms in stark, momentary clarity. I had gathered what candles I could find and set them up in the living room, creating a small island of wavering light. My phone battery was at 30%, and with no idea when the power might return, I was conserving it carefully. I tried to distract myself with a novel I'd been meaning to finish for months, but the constant howl of the wind and the jarring cracks of thunder made concentration impossible. Each time lightning flashed, my eyes would dart to the windows, searching the darkness outside, a growing unease settling in my stomach. It was just after 11 when something peculiar happened. During a particularly bright flash of lightning, I glimpsed something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of my back porch, partially obscured by the curtain of rain, was a figure. It was tall and still, seemingly unbothered by the torrential downpour soaking it through. In the brief moment of illumination, I could make out that it was wearing some kind of long coat, its face hidden beneath what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. I froze, my book falling from my hands. When darkness returned, I strained my eyes trying to see if the figure was still there, but could make out nothing in the pitch black. Another flash came seconds later, and the space where the figure had stood was empty. "You're just seeing things," I whispered to myself, but my racing heart suggested otherwise. It was probably just the old scarecrow from the Hendersons' property, blown over in the wind. Despite my attempts at rationalization, I found myself moving toward the back door, flashlight in hand. I hesitated with my palm against the cool wood, wondering if checking outside was really a good idea. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear, and I cracked the door open, pointing my flashlight into the deluge. The beam cut through the curtains of rain, illuminating the empty porch and the flooded backyard beyond. I swept the light across the property, seeing nothing but rain-battered plants and debris scattered by the wind. After a thorough scan that revealed nothing unusual, I closed and locked the door, double-checking that it was secure. "Just your imagination, Ethan," I muttered, trying to calm myself as I returned to the living room. I had just settled back into my chair when a soft but distinct knocking sound came from the front door. 3 gentle taps, barely audible over the storm, yet unmistakable. My entire body tensed. Who could possibly be out in this weather? None of my neighbors would venture out in such conditions, and certainly not at this hour. A stranded motorist looking for help, perhaps. But my house was set back nearly a quarter-mile from the main road, and there was no way someone would randomly choose this isolated property to seek assistance. I approached the front door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The porch light had died with the rest of the power, and all I could see was darkness. Lightning flashed again, but revealed nothing. No visitor waiting on my doorstep. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it a few inches, keeping the chain engaged. Cold wind and rain immediately assaulted me, but there was no one there. I quickly shut and locked the door, my unease growing by the second. "This is how people die in horror movies," I said aloud, trying to lighten my own mood with gallows humor. I decided to do a security check of the entire house. Moving from room to room with my flashlight, I verified that every window was locked and every entry point secured. As I passed by the front bay window, a movement caught my eye from the street. I carefully approached the window, staying partially hidden behind the curtain. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and what I saw sent ice through my veins. The figure was standing at the edge of my property, where the gravel driveway met the main road. It was even taller than I had first thought, unnaturally so, and completely motionless despite the gale-force winds whipping around it. The long coat I had glimpsed earlier was actually some kind of hooded cloak that concealed its entire body. And where a face should have been, there was only shadow. The light faded, and I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When the next lightning strike came, I forced myself to look again. The figure had moved closer. It was now halfway up my driveway, standing perfectly still, oriented toward my house like an arrow pointing at its target. I stumbled back from the window, grabbing my phone with trembling hands. I dialed 911, but to my horror, there was no service. The storm had taken down the cell towers. I retreated to the center of the house, to my small home office with no windows, taking my candles and flashlight with me. I locked the door behind me, though I knew it was a flimsy interior door that would provide little real protection. Time crawled by agonizingly slowly. Every few minutes, I would gather my courage and venture out to check the windows. Each time lightning flashed, the cloaked figure had moved closer to the house, covering ground with impossible patience, as if it had all the time in the world and knew exactly where I was. The last time I checked, around 2 in the morning, it was standing directly beneath the large oak tree in my front yard, less than 20 feet from my porch. Its hood was tilted up toward my second-floor bedroom window, as if it knew that's where I should be sleeping. I retreated to my office again, pushing a heavy bookcase in front of the door. For the next several hours, I sat in that room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. My flashlight and an antique letter opener clutched in my hands as pathetic weapons. At some point, exhaustion must have overcome terror, because I woke with a start to sunlight streaming through the crack under the door. The storm had passed. The house was quiet, except for the steady drip of water from the gutters outside. It took me several minutes to work up the courage to move the bookcase and open the office door. The house was exactly as I had left it. No signs of intrusion, no broken windows, no muddy footprints on the floor. I approached the front door cautiously and peered outside. My yard was a mess of fallen branches, scattered leaves, and debris, but there was no sign of any visitor. The morning sun revealed nothing unusual, just the aftermath of a powerful storm. I spent the morning convincing myself that what I had seen was a product of stress, isolation, and the playing of light and shadow during the storm. It was a comforting explanation that I almost believed, until I went to retrieve my mail that afternoon. There, at the foot of my driveway where I had first spotted the figure, was a perfect circle of dead grass, about 3 feet in diameter, as if all life had been drained from that exact spot. In the center of the circle lay a single black feather, too large to belong to any bird native to Massachusetts. I left for Chicago that evening to join my family, and we put the house up for sale the following week. Some things you simply don't try to explain away. My name is Ethan Blackwood, and whatever watched me through the storm that night, I'm certain it wasn't human. And I'm equally certain it's still out there, waiting for the next perfect storm. It was the dead of winter in northern Minnesota when my 3 college buddies and I decided we needed an escape from our hectic lives in Minneapolis. We found this perfect little cabin on a rental app, secluded, nestled between a frozen lake and miles of snow-covered pine forest. The listing promised no neighbors for at least 2 miles in any direction. Perfect for unwinding, or so we thought. The weather forecast predicted clear skies despite the bitter cold, typical for January in these parts. We packed our SUV with enough food and drinks to last the long weekend, winter gear, board games, and our optimism. The drive up north was filled with nostalgic stories from our freshman year and debates about which hiking trails we'd explore if the weather permitted. The sun was already setting when we arrived. That early winter darkness creeping in around 4 in the afternoon. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. A charming A-frame with wooden siding and a large stone chimney. Snow had been cleared from the driveway recently, which we found odd since the listing mentioned the place had been vacant for weeks. We unloaded our things, cranked up the heat, and Jason got a fire going in the old stone fireplace. The interior was cozy, all wooden panels and rustic furniture, with a couple of deer heads mounted on the walls. Classic Minnesota cabin decor. Trent and I unpacked the groceries, while Melissa connected her phone to the portable speaker, filling the space with indie folk music. Around 6 o'clock, we bundled up and walked down to the frozen lake. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie bluish glow across the icy surface. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees, but there was something mesmerizing about standing there in the silence, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Listen," Melissa whispered. No cars, no planes, not even animals. She was right. The silence was absolute, almost oppressive. I hadn't experienced anything like it living in the city. Back at the cabin, we prepared dinner together, steaks, baked potatoes, and a bottle of whiskey to keep us warm. We were halfway through our meal when the first signs of trouble appeared. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees with such force that the windows rattled. The weather app still showed clear skies, but looking outside, we could see heavy clouds rolling in, blotting out the stars and moon. "So much for the reliable forecast," Jason joked, but there was an edge to his voice. We were all thinking the same thing. Being snowed in at a remote cabin wasn't part of the plan. By 9, the storm hit in full force. Snow pelted against the windows, and the wind screamed around the cabin's corners. The temperature dropped further, and despite the fire and heating system, we could feel drafts seeping through the cabin's old frame. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. "Well, that's just perfect," Trent muttered, using his phone flashlight to find the emergency lanterns mentioned in the rental guide. We gathered in the living room, 3 lanterns casting long shadows across the walls, and tried to maintain our spirits with another round of drinks and ghost stories. A decision we'd soon regret. It was during Melissa's particularly vivid retelling of a local legend that I noticed something through the window behind her. At first, I thought it was just snow swirling in the wind, but then the shape became more defined, a dark silhouette moving against the white backdrop. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A deer, maybe, but the movement was too deliberate, too. "Human." "Guys," I interrupted, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I think there's someone outside." They all turned to look, just in time to see the figure move past the window. "Probably just branches moving in the storm," Jason suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We killed the lanterns and moved to the windows, peering out into the blizzard. For several minutes, we saw nothing. Then, illuminated briefly by the flashlight on Trent's phone, we spotted a figure, definitely human, standing at the edge of the woods, facing our cabin. "This is impossible," Melissa whispered. "We're miles from anywhere. Who would be out in this storm?" The figure started moving toward the cabin, trudging slowly through the knee-deep snow. We watched, frozen in place, as the stranger approached our front door. There was a moment of terrible silence, broken only by the storm, and then 3 distinct knocks. We exchanged panicked glances. Jason reached for the fireplace poker, while Trent dialed 911 on his phone, only to find we had no service. "Hello?" a voice called from outside, barely audible through the door and over the wind. "Is anyone there?" "I need help." It was a woman's voice, elderly, trembling. Not what we expected. Against everyone's warnings, I approached the door. "Who are you?" I called out. "Margaret Thorne," she replied. "I live about a mile east. My power's out and my generator failed. I saw your lights earlier and tried to make it here before the storm got worse." I looked back at my friends, who shook their heads vigorously. Every horror movie ever made warned against opening the door. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Jason called out, still gripping the poker. There was a pause. Then the woman said something that chilled me more than the blizzard. "The Chapman family used to own this cabin. 3 years ago, they were all found dead here after a winter storm. No one's rented it since. Until you." We stared at each other in disbelief. The listing had mentioned nothing about deaths. "If you don't believe me," the woman continued, "check behind the fireplace mantel. There's a newspaper clipping Thomas Chapman kept about how he purchased this land from my late husband in the 1970s. Trent immediately went to the mantel and felt along its back edge. His face went pale as he pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, exactly as she'd described. With shaking hands, I unbolted the door. Standing before us was indeed an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, bundled in a worn parka crusted with snow. Her face reddened from the cold. We ushered her in quickly, and as I was closing the door, I caught a glimpse of something else moving in the tree line, a taller figure watching us. When I blinked, it was gone, possibly just snow and shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Margaret accepted our offer of tea and blankets, thawing by the fire as she told us about the Chapman family. How they'd been found frozen in their beds after a particularly brutal storm knocked out power to the area. The official cause was hypothermia, but locals whispered about other things. Strange noises in the woods, unexplained footprints in the snow, and the fact that the doors had been unlocked, as if the family had welcomed someone in during the storm. "The rental company should be ashamed, not telling you the history," Margaret said, sipping her tea. "Most locals won't come near this place, especially during winter." As if on cue, the fire in the hearth suddenly dimmed, casting the room in near darkness. For a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw 5 figures reflected in the window instead of our actual 4. Margaret noticed my expression. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she whispered. "They say Thomas Chapman still watches over anyone who stays here. Some say he's protective, others say he's looking for company." Her weathered face broke into an unsettling smile. "I suppose we'll find out which it is before morning." The wind seemed to grow louder then, whistling through the cabin's eaves like distant, mournful voices. None of us slept that night, taking turns keeping the fire alive as Margaret told more stories about the strange happenings in these woods over the decades. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. Margaret asked if we could drive her home once the roads were cleared. As we helped her with her coat, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small, faded photograph falling from her pocket. I picked it up, a family portrait of 4 people standing in front of this very cabin. "Oh, thank you, dear," she said, taking it from me. The Chapmans were good friends. I missed them terribly. As we loaded into our SUV an hour later, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Through the upstairs window, I could have sworn I saw a man's face watching us leave there, and gone in an instant. We drove Margaret to her home, which, unsettlingly, was not 1, but nearly 5 miles away, not the 1 mile she'd claimed. Her property looked like it hadn't been occupied in years, with uncleared snow piled high against boarded windows. "Just drop me here," she said cheerfully. "My son should be arriving soon to check on me." We watched her trudge through the snow to her front door, unlock it with a key produced from her pocket, and disappear inside. None of us spoke on the drive back to Minneapolis. 2 weeks later, out of morbid curiosity, I researched the Chapman family and their cabin. What I found defied explanation. Thomas Chapman and his family had indeed died there during a winter storm, but it happened not 3, but 37 years ago. And according to county records, Margaret Thorne had been found among them, their neighbor who had sought shelter during the blizzard. All 5 of them discovered frozen to death when the snow cleared. The cabin has remained empty ever since. At least that's what the records say. This happened last fall in rural Vermont. I have a German shepherd named Atlas, loyal as they come, but restless with youth and energy. I take him hiking almost daily through the dense woods that surround my cabin. On that particular October afternoon, Atlas and I set out along our usual trail leading to Wilson's Lake. The day had started with that perfect New England crispness. Autumn leaves painted the forest in fiery reds and golds, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. We were about 45 minutes into our hike when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. The birds had stopped singing. In the woods, sudden silence is never a good sign. I glanced up through the canopy and saw dark clouds rushing in from the west, moving unnaturally fast. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in mere minutes. I checked my watch, 3:17, plenty of daylight left, but something about this weather shift felt wrong. Different from the typical fall storms we get in these mountains. "Come on, Atlas. We're heading back," I called. Atlas, typically eager to obey, hesitated. He stood rigid, his ears perked forward, staring deeper into the forest where our path would have taken us. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Atlas now," I commanded, more firmly this time. We turned back, moving at a swift pace. The wind picked up dramatically, whipping through the trees and creating an eerie whistling that seemed to follow us. I glanced over my shoulder several times, unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone on that trail. The darkness deepened, despite it being mid-afternoon, and I pulled out my flashlight, even though we were still a half hour from the cabin. That's when I first heard it, a sound like footsteps, but not quite. More like something heavy being dragged across the forest floor, punctuated by what almost sounded like whispers. I quickened our pace to a near jog. The first raindrops felt wrong against my skin, too heavy, almost oily. Atlas whined and pressed closer to my leg as we moved. We were about 15 minutes from home when the downpour began in earnest. Through the sheets of rain, I swore I saw a figure standing among the trees, just off the path, motionless, watching. When I trained my flashlight in that direction, nothing was there. By the time we reached the cabin, we were soaked through. The storm had reached biblical proportions. Lightning split the sky in jagged patterns I'd never seen before, and the thunder seemed to shake the very foundation of my home. I quickly locked the door behind us, switched on every light, and cranked up the wood stove to drive away both the chill and the growing sense of dread. Atlas wouldn't settle. He paced from window to window, his hackles raised, occasionally letting out that same low growl I'd heard in the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just the storm making him anxious. But I've had Atlas since he was 8 weeks old, and I'd never seen him act this way, not during thunderstorms, not during anything. I made myself a strong whiskey and tried to calm my nerves. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow of the wood stove, I heard a distinct scraping at the door, too deliberate to be a branch blown by wind. "Who's there?" I called out, reaching for the baseball bat I keep near the door. No answer, but the scraping continued, moving from the door to the east-facing window, then to the back door. Atlas followed the sound, growling continuously now, his eyes fixed on each spot where the noise appeared. I convinced myself it must be a desperate animal seeking shelter, perhaps a bear or a desperate coyote. But no animal I know moves quite like that, methodically testing each possible entrance to a human dwelling. The night stretched endlessly. Every time I thought the scratching had stopped for good, it would begin again somewhere else around the cabin. Sometimes it was accompanied by what sounded like quiet, unintelligible whispering. I sat with my back against the wall, Atlas pressed against me, bat in hand, until the first hint of dawn broke through the clouds. With the light, the noises ceased. The storm subsided to a gentle rain, then stopped altogether. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I found something that still gives me chills when I think about it. Around the entire perimeter of my cabin, pressed into the muddy soil, was a single set of footprints. Not animal tracks, human-like footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be only 4 toes. And they only went in one direction, circling the cabin again and again, at least 7 complete loops. I took photos and showed them to the local game warden when he came by later that day to check on residents after the storm. He stared at them for a long time before handing back my phone. "Probably just some animal tracks distorted by the rain," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We've had some strange reports since that storm moved through. Best to just forget about it." But he added extra patrols in our area for the next month, and I noticed he checked his sidearm before walking back to his truck. Atlas still doesn't like to go on that particular trail, and I've started carrying more than just a flashlight when we hike. Whatever came with that storm hasn't returned, at least not yet. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights when the wind picks up, I still hear what sounds like whispering outside my bedroom window. And Atlas still growls at shadows that shouldn't move the way they do. I've lived in these mountains my entire life and weathered countless storms. But I've come to believe there are some storms that bring more than just rain and wind. Some storms open doors that should remain closed, even if just for a few hours in the darkness. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever stepped through that night is still here, waiting for the next storm to move freely again. It was a cold Tuesday night in December, just outside of Boston. The kind of night where the fog rolls in thick off the harbor, making the streetlights look like hazy orbs floating in the darkness. I've been driving taxis in this city for almost 15 years now, and winter nights are always the slowest. I was parked outside South Station, engine idling to keep the heat running, when he appeared. One moment the sidewalk was empty, and the next there he stood. A military man, navy from the looks of his uniform. He was tall, with a weather-beaten face that suggested he'd seen things most of us couldn't imagine. "Evening," he said as he slid into the back seat. His voice was quiet but commanding. "Could you take me to the old lighthouse on North Point?" The lighthouse was an odd destination at this hour, nearly 30 miles up the coast and mostly deserted this time of year. But fares were scarce, and I wasn't about to turn down the money. "Sure thing," I replied, pulling away from the curb. For the first 20 minutes, we rode in complete silence. Through my rearview mirror, I could see him staring out the window, his expression unreadable, almost blank. The rain started coming down harder, drumming on the roof of my cab. "Been in the service long?" I finally asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Long enough," he answered. Then after a pause, 3 tour. This would have been my 4th, but he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. About 5 miles from the lighthouse, he suddenly sat forward. "Mind if we stop at that gas station up ahead? Need to use the restroom." I pulled into a nearly empty Sunoco station, its fluorescent lights harsh against the dark countryside. The place looked like it was about to close for the night, with just one sleepy attendant visible through the window. "I'll wait right here," I told him. He nodded and walked into the store. I watched him exchange a few words with the attendant, who pointed toward the back. Then he disappeared down a hallway. I settled in to wait, scrolling through messages on my phone. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The attendant started turning off some of the lights, and I realized they were closing. Figuring my passenger might have gotten held up, I went inside. "Excuse me," I said to the young woman behind the counter. "My passenger's still in your restroom. Mind giving him a couple more minutes?" She gave me a strange look. "What passenger?" "The Navy guy who came in about 15 minutes ago." She shook her head slowly. "Sir, nobody's come in here for the past hour except you. It's been dead all night. That's impossible." I watched him walk in. Tall guy, Navy uniform. You pointed him to the bathroom. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Mister, I've been the only one working tonight. I haven't directed anyone to the bathroom, and there's definitely nobody in there now." She gestured to the bathroom door, which stood wide open, clearly empty. "Is there another exit?" I asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Just the front door. Nobody could have left without you seeing them." I felt the blood drain from my face. I thanked her and walked back to my cab in a daze. The back seat was empty, just as I'd left it. But there, on the seat where he had been sitting, was a worn Navy insignia patch that hadn't been there before. Here's the strangest part. When I got home that night, I looked up the North Point lighthouse on my computer. It had been decommissioned in the 60s, but before that, it had been used as a naval lookout point during World War II. A small plaque commemorates the 3 sailors who died there during a German U-boat attack in 1942. I've been driving this taxi for a decade and a half. I've seen all kinds of people come and go, but I've never again seen that Navy man, and I've never again taken a fare to that lighthouse. Some passengers, it seems, are just passing through in more ways than one. It happened last winter in Chicago. I was at my friend's New Year's party downtown. You know, one of those fancy high-rise apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the frozen lake. The party was great, but around 2 in the morning, I was exhausted and decided to call it a night. It was snowing heavily, and the temperature had dropped to something ridiculous like 15 below zero. No way I was walking or waiting for public transit. So I ordered a ride sphere, one of those newer rideshare apps that had been undercutting Uber's prices. The app said my driver, James, would arrive in 3 minutes in a blue Honda Civic. When the car pulled up, I double-checked the license plate against the app, saw it matched, and jumped in the back seat, desperate to escape the cold. That's when I noticed him. There was another passenger sitting in the back seat on the opposite side, a man wearing a dark gray peacoat and a black knit cap pulled low over his eyes. I hesitated for a second, but the driver said, "Where to, sir?" like everything was normal. Is this a shared ride?" I asked, my breath still visible inside the car. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror with a confused expression. "No, sir. Just you?" I looked back at the man in the cap, who was staring straight ahead, not acknowledging either of us. Maybe the driver had forgotten to drop off his previous passenger. I gave my address in Wicker Park, figuring we'd sort it out on the way. During the ride, I noticed something strange. The car was freezing cold, even though the heater was blasting. And the man in the cap never moved, never shifted, never even seemed to breathe. I tried making small talk with the driver, but he kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, cutting his sentences short. After about 15 minutes, we pulled up to my apartment building. I paid through the app, thanked the driver, and got out. As I walked toward my building entrance, I heard another car door shut behind me. When I turned around, the man in the knit cap was standing on the sidewalk, watching me. The car was already pulling away. Something about his posture made my skin crawl. He stood perfectly still in the falling snow, not even hunching against the cold. Then he took a step toward me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran toward my building, fumbling with my keys. As I reached the entrance, I glanced back. He was running too, not in a frantic way, but with deliberate, measured steps that somehow covered ground alarmingly fast. I managed to get inside and slam the door shut just as he reached the steps. Through the glass, I could see him standing there, face still mostly hidden by that cap. He raised one hand and placed it against the door, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. My hands shaking, I called the ride sphere driver. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, who was that guy in your car?" I asked. There was a long pause. "What guy?" "The man in the back seat with me. The one in the cap who followed me to my door." Another pause. "Sir, you were my only passenger tonight." My blood went cold. "But he was right there. You must have seen him." The driver's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Look, I didn't want to say anything during the ride because..." Well, it sounds crazy. When I picked you up, you were alone. But in my rearview mirror, I kept seeing something in the seat next to you. It was like a shadow that came and went. And the car was so cold, no matter how high I turned up the heat. I sat down on my stairs, my legs suddenly weak. Did you hear anything? Did he say anything? No, but the driver hesitated. When I first started my shift tonight, something weird happened. I picked up a man in a dark coat and cap from the train station. He was my first ride. During the trip, he started talking about other passengers I would pick up later. He described you perfectly, what you'd be wearing, where I'd pick you up, even that you'd be going to Wicker Park. He knew details about you that no one could know. Then he asked me to drop him off at an address, but when I got there, it was an empty lot. When I turned around, he was gone from my car. Just gone. I thanked the driver and hung up. Still shaken, I called RideSphere customer support to check the record of my trip. They confirmed that I had been picked up as a single passenger. There was no record of any shared ride or previous passenger. The next day, driven by a curiosity I couldn't suppress, I took the train to the address where the driver said he'd picked up his first passenger. It was the old Central Station, a historic building that had been closed for renovations for over 6 months. When I asked a construction worker about the renovations, his face darkened. Yeah, they found something when they started digging. Some old remains. The story goes that back in the 1930s, a man was murdered here, robbed and killed while waiting for a train. They say he still tries to get home sometimes, hitching rides with unsuspecting travelers. I don't use rideshare apps anymore. I bought a car the following week. Sometimes, especially on snowy nights, I look in my rearview mirror half expecting to see a man in a dark coat and cap sitting in my back seat. And sometimes, when the temperature drops suddenly for no reason, I wonder if he's still trying to get home, or if he's found someone new to follow. I was working nights at food fast delivery, back in the winter of 1997. The dot-com boom was just starting to take off, and our little town on the outskirts of Seattle was beginning to feel the ripple effects. More money, more late-night orders, and longer delivery routes. That particular Thursday night was brutal. A combination of freezing rain and gusty winds that made every delivery an adventure. Around 11:30, just as I was hoping my shift would end, a last-minute order came in. 6 extra-large gourmet pizzas and 4 2-liter sodas for a location I'd never delivered to before. The address was way out on Pinewood Trail, a good 35-minute drive into the densely forested hills. These hills had once been logging territory, but were now mostly vacation properties and a few old homesteads. The order total was nearly $100, so I figured it had to be some tech company retreat or family gathering. Maybe I'd score a decent tip. My boss, Darren, handed me the receipt with a smirk. Last one for tonight, Aaron. Better not come back with these. Darren was notorious for docking our pay if we returned with undelivered food. He called it wasted inventory, but we all knew he just hated losing money. The company policy stated we were supposed to attempt delivery twice before returning, but Darren often pushed us to try 3 or 4 times. I loaded the pizzas and drinks into my beat-up Honda Civic, cranked the heater, and pulled up the directions on my primitive GPS unit. The device was new technology at the time, and half the backroads weren't even programmed into it yet. I double-checked the address with a road map before heading out. The drive started normally enough, streetlights giving way to darkness as I left town. The rain intensified, pelting my windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. The road gradually narrowed, turning from asphalt to gravel, until I was bouncing along what was essentially a forest trail. After what felt like forever, my headlights illuminated a small wooden sign, Pinewood Trail. I turned onto an even narrower path that twisted through towering evergreens. My headlights threw eerie shadows across the road, making the trees look like they were reaching for my car. Finally, I reached what appeared to be the address. It was a Victorian-style house, at least 100 years old, standing in a small clearing. The place looked both abandoned and occupied at the same time, peeling paint and overgrown gardens, but with warm yellow light glowing from several windows. What struck me as odd was the complete absence of cars or any signs of a gathering. No music, no voices, nothing to suggest 6 pizzas and 4 sodas were necessary. Just that house, alone in the woods, illuminated against the black forest backdrop. I parked and called Darren on my clunky flip phone, asking him to confirm the address. "For Christ's sake, Aaron, I don't have time for this," he barked. "Just knock on the damn door. If nobody answers, try again. I'm not eating the cost of 6 specialty pizzas because you're too scared of the dark." His words stung, but they also motivated me. I wasn't about to let him mock me for being afraid. Plus, I desperately needed this job to pay for community college. I grabbed the insulated bags and trudged through the mud toward the house. The porch steps creaked ominously under my weight. There was no doorbell, so I knocked firmly on the weathered door, trying to sound confident. No response. I waited a full minute before knocking again, louder this time. "Food delivery," I called out, my voice sounding strange and small against the vastness of the forest. Just as I was about to give up, I heard movement inside. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but a strange scraping sound, like furniture being slowly dragged across hardwood floors. The sound stopped abruptly. I knocked a 3rd time. "Hello? I have your pizza order." Silence again. But this time the silence felt intentional, like someone was deliberately not answering. My uneasiness was growing by the second. I turned to head back to my car when something caught my eye. A pale face was pressed against a nearby window, watching me. I could only make out the eyes, unnaturally wide and unblinking, staring directly at me with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. I dropped the pizza bags and ran. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat as I sprinted back to my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got inside. I locked the doors immediately and tried to start the engine. It wouldn't turn over. I tried again, and again. On the 4th attempt, the engine finally roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, backing away from that house as fast as I dared on the muddy road. I hadn't gotten more than 50 yards when the car began to handle strangely. The steering became increasingly difficult, and there was a rhythmic thumping sound coming from below. Something was definitely wrong. I pulled over and, against my better judgment, stepped out to check. What I saw nearly made my legs give out. All 4 tires had been slashed, not just punctured, but systematically cut with long, deliberate gashes that had completely flattened them. The metal rims were already sinking into the soft mud of the road. My mind raced through the timeline. I'd only been at the door for maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes was all it took for someone to circle my car and destroy all 4 tires without making a sound. Instead of running blindly into the woods, I got back into my car and locked the doors again. I could still see the outline of the house through the trees, faintly illuminated by the moon that occasionally peeked through the storm clouds. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately, and I explained my situation as clearly as I could, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Officers Kennedy and Martinez are about 20 minutes from your location, she assured me. Stay on the line with me and remain in your vehicle with the doors locked. Is there anyone visible outside right now? I scanned the area through my foggy windows. No, I don't see anyone, but I know they're out there. Someone slashed my tires while I was at the door. The officers are on their way, she repeated. Just stay calm. And that's when I made the mistake of checking my rearview mirror. The face from the window was now directly behind my car, staring in through the back window. In the dim red glow of my taillights, I could see it was a woman, or something that resembled a woman. Her eyes were still unnaturally wide, and now I could see her mouth stretching into a smile that was far too wide for any human face. Her teeth gleamed in the red light. But what truly horrified me was that she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a tall, gaunt figure, a man in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, holding what appeared to be a long, curved farming implement. He was partially hidden in shadow, but I could see that his head was tilted at an impossible angle. Pure terror took over. I dropped the phone, unlocked the door, and bolted into the forest. I ran without direction, crashing through underbrush, slipping on wet leaves, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and those things. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to collapse. Finally, I ducked behind the massive trunk of a fallen cedar, trying desperately to quiet my ragged breathing by covering my mouth with both hands. Minutes stretched like hours as I crouched there, soaked to the bone from the rain, listening for any sound of pursuit. Eventually, in the distance, I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. Gathering what little courage I had left, I made my way back toward the road, using the siren lights as a guide. When the flashing red and blue lights finally came into view, I stumbled out of the tree line, waving frantically and shouting. 2 officers were examining my car with flashlights when I emerged. Upon seeing my state, Officer Kennedy, as his nameplate identified him, rushed over to help me. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" he asked, supporting me as my adrenaline crashed and my legs finally gave out. Between gasps, I told them everything. The house, the face in the window, the slashed tires, the 2 figures behind my car. Officer Martinez radioed for backup, while Kennedy got me a blanket from their cruiser. Once I was somewhat calmer, Martinez drove me to the station, while Kennedy and the backup units went to investigate the house. 3 hours later, Kennedy returned to the station. His expression was grim. We searched the entire property, he told me. The house was completely empty, no furniture, no sign anyone's lived there for years. There were footprints in the mud around your car, and we found this in the bushes nearby. He showed me an evidence bag containing what looked like an old farming sickle, its blade rusty, but recently sharpened along the edge. The handle was wrapped in weathered leather that had darkened with age, and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The strangest thing, Kennedy continued, is that according to county records, that house has been abandoned since 1968, when the previous owners, the Whitaker family, disappeared without a trace. The husband was suspected of killing his wife and then himself, but bodies were never found. A chill ran down my spine. But I saw lights in the windows. There's no electricity connected to that property, Martinez interjected. Hasn't been for decades. They drove me home that night and arranged for my car to be towed to a repair shop. I quit my delivery job the very next day and found work at the local mall, safely surrounded by people and bright lights. The police never found any suspects. The case file remains open but inactive, filed away as an unsolved vandalism incident. But I know what I saw. Sometimes when I drive past the turn to Pinewood Trail, I swear I can see lights flickering through the trees, even though that old Victorian house was finally demolished in 2005. And on particularly dark nights, when the wind rustles through the evergreens just right, I can almost hear something scraping, dragging itself slowly across hardwood floors, coming ever closer. I always walked my dog at dawn in my neighborhood. It became a kind of ritual, waking up at 5 in the morning, having a cup of coffee, and going for a walk when the first rays of sun were just beginning to touch the tall pine trees around our town. Nothing interesting ever happened during these walks. I just walked around a few blocks, enjoyed the silence, and returned home to get ready for the workday. For context, I'm a 27-year-old woman living in a small mountain town in the suburbs, which tourist brochures describe as an idyllic corner of tranquility. Our town is known for its safety, with an almost zero crime rate, and in the 10 years I've lived here, I never felt afraid except for one morning. It was the end of autumn, when mornings become especially cold, and fog wraps everything around in a mysterious veil. I woke up as usual at 5, put on my favorite warm sweater the color of heather honey, poured coffee into my thermos mug, and prepared Max, my golden retriever, for our daily walk. The sky was still dark, but the streetlights placed along the streets of our neighborhood created enough light for me to see the road. We left the house around 5:30. The air was unusually cold and thick with fog, which swirled between the trees and limited visibility to a few dozen meters. I took our usual route, first down our street, then turned the corner and walked along the old apple orchard that separated our neighborhood from the countryside park. This route formed a perfect circle back to my house, and usually took about 25 minutes. The silence was so complete that I could hear the dewdrops falling from the leaves. This wasn't unusual for autumn mornings in our town. For a moment I stopped, allowing Max to sniff the trunk of an old apple tree, and looked around, enjoying the peace. That's when I noticed a car parked about 70 meters away from me, on the side of the road that led through the orchard. All exterior lights were off, but the interior light was on. and in it I could see the silhouette of a person moving in the front seat. This immediately seemed strange. Who could be in a car in the middle of an apple orchard at 5:30 in the morning, when the fog was so thick that visibility was limited and the temperature barely above zero? I tried not to stare, but curiosity got the better of me. The car wasn't parked near any house, and the morning was too cold and foggy for someone to just stop to enjoy the view. I wasn't alarmed, just puzzled. I gently tugged on the leash, and Max and I continued walking. As we approached the car, I saw that behind the wheel sat a man who was nervously searching through something in the glove compartment. He was energetically looking for something, scattering papers and small items. I was still trying not to look directly at him, to avoid drawing attention, when he suddenly turned his head and met my gaze. My first reaction was to look away, but then I looked again. At that point, the distance between us had shortened to about 10 meters, and the man waved at me in a friendly manner and lowered the car window. "Excuse me, could you help me?" He called through the window with an accent I couldn't immediately identify. The man looked about my age, maybe a little older, with a buzz cut, and wearing a dark jacket that seemed too light for such cold weather. I asked what he needed, and he began explaining that his car had suddenly stalled, and he couldn't start the engine. He launched into technical details about the carburetor and fuel pump, using terms I didn't understand. In any case, I couldn't help him. "Sorry, but I don't understand anything about cars," I replied, gripping the leash a little tighter and quickening my pace. After walking a few meters, I heard the car window going up, then the sound of the engine starting, and a second later, the noise of the car driving away. I turned around and saw the same man calmly driving his silver sedan, as if there had never been any problems with the car. Seeing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. The man had lied about the car malfunction. After a moment of shock, I turned and walked faster, holding the leash firmly. My house was about 15 minutes away, and my head was swarming with thoughts about how disturbing it was that the man could drive normally right after saying his car wouldn't start. I continued walking along the orchard for about 10 more minutes until I reached the last part of the route, a narrow path that ran behind several houses and led to the back of my neighborhood. This was the darkest and most isolated part of the entire route. When I reached this section, I walked even faster, almost breaking into a run, trying to get home as quickly as possible. However, as I was passing through this dark part of the path, ahead, on the street that crossed the path at the end, I saw the same car. I could only see the front part of the car, but it was definitely the same silver sedan. It seemed to be parked in some strategic way to remain unnoticed in the fog. With my heart pounding wildly, I abruptly turned and pulled Max back, starting to run in the opposite direction. When we returned to the orchard, I chose a different path and took an alternative route home, which was much longer, but passed through well-lit streets with many houses. Fortunately, it seemed that the man could no longer find me. My heart was still racing when I finally reached home. As soon as we got inside, I immediately called the police to report the incident. Unfortunately, I realized that I hadn't memorized the car's license plate. The worst part was that a few days later, I saw the same car again, parked not far from my walking route. But this time, all the lights were completely off. As soon as I noticed the car, I immediately called the police. When they arrived and checked the car, it turned out that no one was inside, and checking the license plate showed that the car had been stolen. I felt sick when I learned that the car was stolen. This confirmed my suspicions that the man was dangerous. It's crazy to think that I always felt safe living in such a quiet town, and yet something terrible could have happened to me. Sometimes I wonder what exactly that man was so nervously searching for in the car's glove compartment that morning. A weapon, drugs, something else. I will never know for sure what that man wanted on that foggy autumn morning, and I never want to find out. Since that day, I've changed the route for our walks with Max. Now we only go out later in the morning when there are other people on the streets, and I always carry pepper spray with me. I've also installed an app on my phone that sends my location to my sister and emergency services with one touch. But even now, when fog envelops our quiet town, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the fog, someone might be waiting who's looking for an easy victim. This story happened when I was a 13-year-old kid living in a small mining town in Colorado. It was the mid-90s, and our family had just moved into this old Victorian house on the edge of town. Money was always tight for us. My father had left years ago, and Mom was struggling to raise 4 kids on her teacher's salary. Being the youngest, I got stuck with the smallest bedroom on the first floor. My room was tucked away at the end of a long hallway, right next to the living room. It was basically a square box with these beautiful but creaky hardwood floors that had seen better days. The most distinctive feature was the 4 ventilation grates, 2 large ones on the floor at opposite corners, and 2 matching ones on the ceiling. They were ornate cast iron things, probably original to the house from the early 1900s. My bed barely fit against one wall, and with my small dresser, that was pretty much all the space I had. No desk meant I always did my homework sprawled across my bed, which is exactly what I was doing one particularly cold November evening. I remember it clearly. I was struggling through some algebra problems, the old radiator in the corner making those typical clanking noises as it fought against the mountain chill. That's when I heard it, a child's laughter, soft but distinct, almost like it was coming from somewhere inside my room. At first, I thought it must be one of my siblings messing with me. I put down my textbook and walked through the hallway, checking the living room and kitchen. Nobody was there. I called upstairs, and I could hear all 3 of my siblings talking with Mom in her bedroom. They were watching some TV show together. Now, people often dismiss these kinds of experiences, saying they must have imagined it. But that's ridiculous. I know what I heard. The laughter was too clear, too real to be my imagination. It had a quality to it that felt present. I went back to my room, slightly unnerved, but convincing myself it was probably just the TV sound carrying weirdly through the house. I tried to focus back on my homework, but I found myself listening intently for any unusual sounds. Maybe 15 minutes passed before it happened again. This time the laughter was longer, almost playful, and it definitely wasn't coming from outside my room. It seemed to be originating from inside, and as I followed the sound, I realized it was coming from one of the floor vents in the corner farthest from my bed. I got down on my hands and knees and placed my ear near the ornate grate. The laughter stopped immediately. For several seconds, there was absolute silence, not even the usual sounds of the house settling. The silence felt heavy, like something was holding its breath. I pulled back slightly, and then, driven by curiosity more than good sense, I positioned my face close to the grate and peered down into the darkness. My eyes took a moment to adjust, and that's when I saw them, two pale eyes staring directly back at me from the darkness below. But here's the part that still haunts me. They weren't children's eyes. They were old, knowing eyes, set in what looked like a child-sized face that was unnaturally pale. And the thing smiled at me, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and sharp for a human mouth. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life and ran straight for my mother's room. My entire family came rushing down, but by the time we returned to my room with flashlights, there was nothing to be seen in the vents. My mother tried to convince me it was probably a raccoon or some other animal that had found its way into the heating ducts. My oldest brother suggested I was just overtired from staying up late too many nights. But I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't anything natural. I refused to sleep in that room for almost 2 weeks, camping out on the floor of my mom's bedroom, until she finally insisted I return to my own space. She did make concessions, though, allowing me to seal the floor vents with duct tape and giving me a small desk lamp that I could keep on all night. The strange thing is, after that night, the house seemed different. I would sometimes hear faint whispers coming from the walls when I was alone, and occasionally items in my room would be in slightly different positions than where I had left them. Nothing dramatic enough to prove anything supernatural, but enough to keep me on edge. We lived in that house for another 4 years before Mom got a better job offer in Arizona, and we thankfully moved away. I never had another direct encounter like that first one, but sometimes in my dreams, I still see those eyes looking up at me, and I wake up to the fading sound of a child's laughter. What makes it even stranger is that years later, when I was in college, I did some research on our old house. Turns out it was built on land that once belonged to an orphanage that burned down in 1911. The records said that not all the children were accounted for after the fire. I don't know what was in those vents that night, but whatever it was, I'm certain it wasn't human, at least not anymore. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.